Welcome everyone. Today our featured speaker is Paul Ward. He is the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs at the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. And during his webinar, Paul will discuss how developing natural resource management is an exercise of tribal sovereignty. Paul spent 22 years working for Yakama Nation Fisheries before becoming the director at CRITFC. Paul attended the University of Washington, earning a BA in history, a JD from UW Law School, and an executive master's of public administration from the UW Evans School of Public Policy and Governance. Paul is an enrolled Yakama tribal member and also a Cherokee descendant. Having grown up on the Yakama Reservation from a young age, he is an active hunter for the families and churches of the reservation. Paul has 3 adult children and his grandson, Luke. Currently, Paul participates on 2 boards, the National Forest Foundation Pacific Northwest Advisory Board and the Ruckle House Center Advisory Board. So I want to welcome Paul as our guest speaker today.
Thank you, Damaris and Ashley, Clarita. Thanks. I appreciate the invitation. I'm honored to be invited to speak. I had a call with Clarita last week to figure out more of what the group is working on specifically. I hope that I can offer something that's useful. And I apologize if I'm not better prepared. This came up sooner. I think 3 options were published, and I said, well, I can make any of the 3, and they're like, okay, well, we'll go next week. And I was like, okay. So my background you just heard. I do have also a 6-month-old granddaughter, Tamaya, and in addition to my 3 children and my grandson. We live here on the Yakama Indian Reservation in Central Washington. My dad was a Bureau of Indian Affairs administrator, and earlier in life we moved around until we came back here. 3 of my grandparents were Yakama. I had a grandmother that was Cherokee, and this is our home on the reservation. I is alluded to in my bio that I hunt, and I look at both the hunting but also the work I do as a privilege and as a responsibility, and to be able to do what we can for both the people that, the people I work for, but also the resources. If you go to the CRITFC website, you'll find quite a bit of information there about the organization I work for now. I recognize that it's a vastly different paradigm or situation that we have here in Central Washington in the Columbia Basin versus what your experience is in Alaska. But I'd like to run through really quick, kind of a short history. In 1855, the United States forced Yakama Nation, and I'm going to reference Yakama Nation largely because that's my work history. Much of this is true for the other tribes around here. But we had a treaty that was entered into with the federal government, and it pulled together 14 tribes and bands on the Washington side of the Columbia River, what is now the Washington side, the north side of the Columbia River, and placed them on a reservation. We ceded 11 million acres of land and reserved about 10% of that 1.3 million acres for a reservation. And an additional reservation was the right to take fish at usual and accustomed stations in common with the citizens of the territory. This was before statehood for Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and there was an Oregon Territory that had been created. That right, along with hunting and pasturing of animals and gathering foods on the landscape on open and unclaimed lands, that right on fishing has been litigated extensively. The Yakama had to go to war with the United States. They call it the Yakama Indian Wars. It was a running skirmish from the Puget Sound to the Spokane Plain, and it involved all the tribes in what is now Washington State, or a large portion of them. Finally, to end that war, our treaty was ratified by the Senate and signed by the President, President Buchanan, in 1859. You fast forward to 1905, and our access to the fisheries on the Columbia River was actually upheld in the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called U.S. v. Winans. You fast forward another 50, 60 years, and you had this ongoing dispute with the state of Washington over the treaty fishing rights. And in the 1960s, it became the U.S. v. Oregon, excuse me, the U.S. v. Oregon proceeding for the Columbia Basin, and the U.S. v. Washington proceeding for the Puget Sound and Washington coast. There's 22 tribes in Washington and the U.S. v. Washington area, and there's 5 tribes in the Columbia Basin, Yakama, Nez Perce, Umatilla, and Warm Springs, which make up the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and then the Shoshone-Bannock in southern Idaho. Is through this federal court proceeding that our rights to access the fishery, as spelled out in the treaty, were legally upheld. Just like Alaska, on the West Coast, the Columbia River, we've all had challenges. Our resources have had challenges. They've had damage from, development, non-Indian development, for farming and industrial uses and logging, hydro system development, habitat degradation, over harvesting, harvest that was not managed in any fashion. And so, you get into the 1970s, and the Yakama leadership said, if we're going to be part of harvesting these fish, we need to be part of managing for them. Excuse me. And so really the message was, as one of our elders put it, we need to make things like they were, or, really as much as possible as like they were. And we started Yakama Nation, literally in the mid to late 1970s with 1 fish biologist and 2 fish technicians. And we had this litigation under our belt, spelled out our rights. And they began a technically based, fisheries management program. And that's really been key in my mind, that we've always been very technically focused. We look at the science, and combined with the directives of our policymakers that are, about the beliefs of our resource and why it exists, how it exists, how it's supposed to be taken care of, and respected. All that cultural values are imparted to our management activities and exercises. Those activities are technically based, but they're culturally informed. The state of Washington, was ready to walk away from Columbia River salmon, the Yakama Basin. A few years ago, the Washington State governor said, if it was not for the Yakama Nation, there wouldn't be salmon in the Yakama River. And they had really turned their back on them. And so Yakama Nation developed this technically based program and started growing from there. One of the, I think, pivotal points in that development was securing some annual funding from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this funding allowed for kind of cadre of professionals to be hired to work on harvest, to work on habitat, to work on hatchery production, and to work on hydro system impacts to the stocks. And this continued solid funding was really, I think, critical to Yakama Nation to start delving into all the different forms that the non-Indian governments had that affect the management and the fisheries of the Columbia River. Without that fundamental floor of capacity, it'd been very difficult to sustain and then develop and grow a management presence. And so, you fast forward from the 1970s, 1980, substantiating the fishing right through the federal courts, and then the beginning development of technical capacity. And we slowly built that out. Yakama was very active on the halls of Congress. We were there when they amended the Northwest Power Act, which is a regional power act, Department of Energy. It drives Bonneville Power Administration. It was amended to include a fish and wildlife program, and that was to mitigate, at least in part, for the impacts of the hydro system on the fish and wildlife resources of the basin. So that fish and wildlife program began in 1980. One of the things we undertook was to create a hatchery in the upper Yakama to help sustain our wild spring Chinook stock in that area. And it took from 1982 until 1997 for that facility to be completed. It literally took 15 years of advocacy, scientific design, review, and politicking to get that funded and constructed. That facility is still, I think, leading in terms of using science to utilize hatcheries to support a wild stock without impacting their wild fitness, their genetic fitness to survive in a system. So through the Fish and Wildlife Program and this technical program, Yakama Nation developed over years a lot of grant writing, a lot of policy engagement. We continue to work on Capitol Hill and with the administration. We also continued in our litigation. There's a case that actually created is Yakama Nation v. Baldridge, and really drove a lot of the Pacific Salmon Treaty discussion, which all the fish that we were depending on in our Columbia River fishery are subject to ocean fisheries, and they were being hammered by Alaskan and Canadian fisheries. Columbia River salmon make it all the way to Alaska and beyond Southeast Alaska. Some go to Oregon, but mostly they go north. And so those stocks, cross international boundaries, and it was imperative that we find ways to balance out both the adult returns for recruitment of future generations, but also access to the fishery and the benefit of that work. I apologize. I've had a scratchy throat for a while. It's not COVID. I'm good there. But anyways, so, there's just this fundamental technical basis to this program we've created. And we, excuse me. One of the things I really valued in my time at Yakama was this entrepreneurial nature. Our leadership really gave us the marching orders to go out and find the ways to restore these resources. And they gave us a lot of latitude, and we could be, so to speak, entrepreneurial. And so we have both natives and non-natives working on the forest. We created, I think, some really dynamic, some really creative programs. Yakama Nation Fisheries has created a lamprey restoration program. Pacific lamprey are a very significant resource to us. They were down to probably less than 1% of their historic numbers. And we've been working on those, that species for 13 years now. We've also created a white sturgeon conservation program. We're working with hydropower interest in the mid-Columbia, and we're also working with Bonneville Power Administration, and we'll be producing all the conservation fish really from the Chief Joseph Dam on the upper Columbia, the Hell's Canyon complex on the Snake River, down to the estuary of the Columbia River. These are two species, especially the lamprey, that nobody else cared about. The non-Indians didn't care about lamprey. To them, they're a valueless fish, except for using as bait for other fish or maybe for scientific experiments. And it was the treaty tribes in the Columbia Basin, amongst other tribes up and down the coast, that put a value on them and really drove that something be done to start restoring the species. I guess I would, and I want to go on, and I'll turn it over for questions in a second, but the basis for the activities that we've undertaken have been, of course, the treaty reserved right, which was substantiated through both warfare and litigation, but also just the continued advocacy, both in Congress, but also continued litigation. And we litigate as need be it in state court, be it against county zoning laws or implementation of the Endangered Species Act or Clean Water Act violations or CERCLA, Superfund law. We use any and all of those state and federal laws that we can, always putting treaty rights as the last resort. We don't want to jeopardize the treaty right by putting it out front in our litigation activities. But beyond the litigation, I think that's also created a place at the table for us. And as we've developed our technical background, then it's allowed us to really lead the way. And I think in many respects, we are leading the way in protecting and restoring the aquatic resources of the Columbia Basin. We hold the states accountable. We push the states continually. We're pulling them along. And it's true, like the governor said, if it wasn't for the Yakama Nation, there wouldn't be salmon in the Yakama Basin. So that, I know that's really vague in a lot of respects. It's a 10,000 foot overview of a lot of different things that transpired. I know that where you guys are at and what you're working on is different. It's a whole different paradigm. Yakama Nation is 200 employees. We do extensive amounts of habitat work across central Washington. We have hatcheries for lamprey, sturgeon, spring chinook, summer chinook, fall chinook, coho, and steelhead. Yakama Nation itself is 12,000 members, I think, now. And so we're situated differently. And I hope that there's something we can find in this that will be transmittable to where your village is at and what your challenges and opportunities are. And, maybe hopefully add to some, creative dialogue and thinking. So with that, I'll just turn it back over to Maris, Ashley, Clarita. Any questions you might have, thoughts?
Ashley?
Go ahead.
So as we enter the question and answer period, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.